Okay, this is the material that we're going to start covering as we head toward the second part of lectures. It's going to be about water flow and about how sessile organisms essentially have to deal with the aspect of water flow in their lives. And we're going to start with a quote from Stephen Vogel in his book Life in Moving Fluids. Bigger whirls have little whirls which feed on their velocity. Little whirls have lesser whirls, and so on to viscosity. This is basically the marine habitat in a nutshell. Those big whirls are large waves that have little whirls or little waves in them, which feed on velocity, speed. Those little whirls that make up the bigger whirls have even lesser whirls all the way down to viscosity, which is the stickiness of fluid. Now, that might not make a whole lot of sense right now, but in a few slides, you'll see what I'm talking about. So when we look at organisms that live in marine habitats, we have to examine where it is that they live and how they deal with waves and currents and getting everything they need in order to survive. Now, we know the effects of waves on habitats. We know that they can be quite severe. What you see is a picture before and after a hurricane from Florida. And you can see the devastation that takes place in those habitats. I mean, that is just remarkable. I don't know if you'd spend a lot of time rebuilding there. A lot of people would, though, and you might be surprised on who actually pays for that to be rebuilt. A lot of this is rebuilt by government funds, which is paid for by taxpayers, which means you probably paid to have all those homes put back there. And then I put that schematic on the right as well. A lot of people don't understand the powers of tsunami and sometimes want to go watch them. Now, we all know that big waves can happen from belly flops. I put that in. I love that picture. That's just one of the most simplest pictures on the whole planet. The tsunami that happened in Thailand just a few years ago, that's pictured on the right. And the tsunami that happened in Japan after the earthquake. That's Japan in the lower left. These should show you the magnitude upon which water plays a big role in coastal habitats. And you can't really fight the power of water because it has momentum. And momentum is can't really stop a speeding rhinoceros too easily because of the momentum that has. In the same way, you can't really stop a wave from coming in just because of all the energy that's stored up behind it. So we're going to investigate how organisms survive in these kind of habitats. So to start, let's think about what a fluid is. Now, the last couple lectures we talked about what marine habitats are and how they differ from terrestrial habitats. Well, now we're going to talk more specifically about a fluid. And what is the distinction between a solid and a fluid? It's obvious for anyone who's looking at it. But for physicists and for biologists, solids resist shear deformation. Meaning, if you go to a large block or a house, you can't really shear it. You can't really run into it and knock it over. Okay, so solids resist those things just because of their structure. A rock, you're not going to change the structure of a rock by pushing on it. But the more that you wish to deform a solid, the more energy that's going to take to do that. So you can deform a solid, but it's going to take you an incredible amount of energy to do it, and most likely the solid's going to break. Now, fluids don't really care much about the shear forces. What they care about is the rate at which they're being deformed. So it's that rate of deformation and not so much the deformation itself that's important to fluids. And this comes out into a Latin term called mu, which is dynamic viscosity, which indicates how much a fluid will resist, not the shear, not being deformed, but the rate of shear. So which fluids resist shear the most, honey or water? I've mentioned this a few times already in a few lectures, and you would know that honey resists shear. You can't stir honey too well in relation to stirring water. Now these factors affect organisms and how they survive. Also, there's a physical property known as the no-slip condition. And what this says is that as a fluid's velocity gets closer and closer to the substrate or the solid, that velocity becomes zero. So at the interface in this schematic between the fluid and the solid, the water flow right there is zero. And so you can have a current going over a habitat. So that tan at the bottom is essentially a habitat. And as you descend closer and closer and closer to that habitat or that substrate, flow decreases dramatically. There's a YouTube video there for you to watch that will demonstrate that nicely. This is important because for organisms that are living on that substrate, they do depend on water flow to bring them food and oxygen and a lot of other things that they need. But if they live in that area where the flow is zero, they're kind of out of luck. They don't really have too much of an opportunity to have water flow bring them food or bring them oxygen. This no-slip condition is a very common phenomenon. It happens everywhere on our planet, wherever there's a fluid's velocity going over some hard surface. Now, the consequences of this no-slip condition is, this explains many things. Why do your cars get dirty? If you can drive your car and go real fast, does it clean it? Well, no, because the air at the interface of your car and the wind is nothing. It's zero. So things start to accumulate on it. Same thing with dust on ceiling fans, dust on fans in general. This is why pipes start to accumulate with deposits, because something is flowing over them, but at that interface of the water flow in the pipe, nothing is flowing over them. It's zero. Hence, things start to get deposited there. Now, what this forms over organisms is what's called a boundary layer. And that boundary layer is usually 10 millimeters thick. It's around the thickness of your thumb fingernail. And this can affect the way species breathe, the way they exchange nutrients, how they remove wastes, and it can also cause the organisms to expend energy. So how does it do this? So let's look how this affects sessile organisms a little more closely. So if you have a sessile organism living on the substrate, remember, there's water flow going over that organism, and that's called free stream flow. Now this is flow that's unimpeded. It's just to what you would experience if you were in a current. So flow has a direction to it, and the organisms have to live in that area. Now, the area between free stream flow and the organism is called a momentum boundary layer, or MBL. And that MBL, I mentioned momentum already today, in saying that you can't stop a charging rhinoceros in the same way that you can't stop a oncoming wave. There's so much momentum and energy behind that would be impossible. But if you remember what we just talked about, the no-slip condition, as that free stream flow gets closer and closer to the organism, the flow decreases dramatically. So that down near the organism, there's another boundary layer called the diffusion boundary layer, or DBL, and that's around 1 millimeter to 10 millimeters thick. 10 millimeters is about the thickness of your thumbnail, or the width of your thumbnail. So if you look at that 1 millimeter, that doesn't seem like a lot. Most organisms can deal with that, and a lot of organisms change their morphology in order to deal with that diffusion boundary layer. But when it gets to be 10 millimeters thick, and there's no water flow really, that organism is sitting in, with no water flow, that means there's no food getting there, no prey items, no oxygen exchange, no waste removal. A lot of things can happen to the biology of a sessile organism if it doesn't have the ability to get nutrients and breathe. So it's that layer there that everything needs to get through in order for the organism to survive. Now, how does flow affect this boundary layer? Well, the diffusional boundary layer decreases with increasing water flow, meaning if the flow is like negligible, it's 10 millimeters thick. If it starts to increase, it decreases down to maybe 1 millimeter thick. And there's different types of flows that are out there. There's laminar flow, where you have just a steady flow that comes over the organism, speeds up over the organism, and then goes downstream. And that's how we, always think of flow, that it's this beautiful laminar directional, movement. But it's not. Most times it's B, turbulent. And where the flow comes up to the organism, quickly it goes over it, and then it produces all these extra little eddy currents that actually push things back into the organism behind the flow stream. So as flow becomes turbulent, it starts mixing up the water next to sessile invertebrates. So most sessile organisms really don't shy away from water flow. They kind of like it, and they need it to bring them oxygen, nutrients, and to remove waste. But they also want to live in an area where they have a constantly decreasing boundary layer. Because if they settle and grow in areas that the boundary layer is thickened, that's going to make life difficult for them. So the benefits of being in where there's high water flow is there's plenty of food, excellent way to remove waste, increase growth, and able to broadcast eggs and sperm far. If you remember, the biological consequences of living in water allow that type of reproduction. So it'd be like you all coming to class and sitting where you sat for exam 1, and me just having this Burger King cannon just blasting Big Macs at you, and you have to capture them, as they go flying by, probably with great speed. In relation to you just sitting there, and an occasional Big Mac enters the room and floats by way above your head, you can't really get to it. So organisms don't necessarily hide from water flow. They kind of enjoy that because it allows them to get prey and nutrients and to remove waste, and these other benefits that they have as well. So, but can organisms alter water flow? Well, yes, they can. And in a paper by Mark Pattison in 1992, I know again, it's an older paper, but it's from an engineer and a seminal paper in the field. They examine the morphologies that allow more oxygen and CO2 and other metabolites. This is called mass transfer, when things go from the water and they get mass transferred onto an organism. And what he found was that the turbulent flow was dependent on the size of the organism, the shape of the organism, the flow speed itself, obviously, and viscosity, which is that gooiness or thickness of water. Obviously, we know about flow. We've already talked about it. The viscosity is mu, the dynamic viscosity that exists, and that's the fluid's resistance to shear, okay, the rate of shear. But the size and shape of organisms we really haven't thought about yet. And that's why when you look at underwater, you see a lot of sessile organisms. There's many different morphologies that they come with, because it would make sense for them to actually create a morphology that would extend up into the boundary layer more to kind of break up water flow to help, other parts of them. Now, a unique aspect of water flow in marine habitats is what sponges can do. Now, this is a common yellow sponge, the yellow encrusting sponge, Cleona salata. It's common throughout Long Island Sound and all local waters. And this can produce currents of up to 20 centimeters per second. Now, think about a 15 centimeter ruler, add 5 centimeters to that, and that's how fast a particle can go in 1 second. That's pretty fast. Now, we know that sponges have this ability because they have flagella, or cilia, and choanocytes that help increase the speed. Now, how can sponges do this so quickly? Well, it's because they use a common physical principle, known that flow is continuous. Okay, and this is just a really common physical principle where S1V1 equals S2V2. And to put simply, what goes in must equal what comes out. So for a sponge, they're constantly filtering water in at a certain rate, and they're filtering out a certain volume of that. And then they have to expel a certain volume with equal velocity, like with a velocity that is consistent with that. So you can't have water going into a sponge. They have the inability to work with it, and the sponge just breaks apart. So the sponge has inlets that allow water to enter at around 50 micrometers per second. They have flagella, ancilia, and choanocytes that restrict the flow up to 6,000 times, so they have this ability to slow flow down. This restriction allows for increased velocity. If you start slowing the flow down, you increase the velocity upon which the water is going to move. If you just take a garden hose and you try to restrict the water flow at the hose, the top of the hose where it's pouring out of, the velocity of the water comes out faster. Now, sponges can filter a great deal of water in the water column. And this leads to the concept of streamlines. So any organism that's on the planet, if it's put in a water flow, that flow speed increases dramatically around that organism. Okay? So if you look at the flow speed at letter A and at letter C, they're similar. If you look at the flow speed at letter B and compare it to A and C, it's different. There's a YouTube video there to help you understand that. But the idea is that what is produced when flow goes around an organism is streamlines. And you see all the different lines on that figure. Those are called streamlines. Streamlines never interact with one another, and they never cross one another, because they're always laminar, they always move in those directions. So why does flow increase around an object? Because it represents a barrier to that flow. The reason that it increases is because of Bernoulli's principle, which is another physics principle. And it has to do with the conservation of energy. There's both kinetic and potential. If one increases, the other has to decrease. But if flow speed increases, what does it do to the pressure at A, B, or C? So A and C are the same. They have the same speed. The speed is lower than B. Hence, they're at a higher pressure. B is faster than A and C, and hence it is at a lower pressure. Now this is all Bernoulli's principle. Okay, I don't think a lot of people think this makes sense because they're going on the idea that faster is more pressure, and that's not the case. In this case, faster is lower pressure. And if we look at some examples of this, this is an organism put in a streamline, just a regular flow chamber, and you can see that the streamlines never interact with one another. They're always disparate and separate. They increase in speed around the organism, and you can see the eddy currents that are produced behind them. And these eddy currents are just those flips up, and flips down on both sides that mess up water flow on the other side of an organism. So Bernoulli's principle, again, if you have low speed, you have a higher pressure, and it moves really slow. On the flip side, if that flow is constricted, you have a lower pressure that ends up moving fast, hence a higher speed. Now this creates some unique problems for marine organisms and how they're going to survive. But a lot of organisms use water flow to kind of help them. So you have flow going over a burrow gets induced flow because of the lower pressure near the mound. So what does this figure demonstrate? Well, at the bottom you have a worm living in a hole it created along the substrate. Many worms throughout Long Island Sound do just this. And if you go to most marine habitats at low tide, you can see little bumps in the sand, little bumps in the mud with holes in them. Those are worm holes. If you dug down there, you'd get a lot of good bait for fishing. So worms have this ability to burrow. As the tide comes in and flow starts going over them, because of Bernoulli's principle, water flow is directed down through the tube that the worm is in and comes out the top of that tube. And then obviously it kicks in with the other flow and just moves downstream. But this is an ideal way to build your home because, one, you're not really out foraging on the substrate much for food. So you build a home so that food is forced directly into your home while you're just sitting there waiting for it. So this worm has the ability to do that. They can just wait for food. So a prey item will come, get forced in through flow. The worm will grab it, will eat it, and release its waste products, and that'll get removed as well. But the other thing that this water flow is bringing in is oxygen. So again, we have oxygen, nutrients, removal of waste, that are being affected by, one, this organism's ability to build this kind of structure, a little burrow, and from the basic principles of Bernoulli's principle and water flow, how that, affects the flow going through that burrow. In a lot of the same ways, many houses or greenhouses out that are built into hills do this same thing, or even underground. So if you have the ability to have an underground home that's built into the side of a hill, you have a natural airflow that's going to always be brought into the home and then out of the home. And that helps keep the home cooler. Now, another organism that this affects is flounders. So you see a problem associated with water flow because of these flounders. Okay, so the flounders sitting on the seabed, and things go toward low pressure because it's increasing in speed over the flounder that's sitting there on the seabed. The minute there's lower pressure above the organism, it causes the organism to essentially be lifted up. It has nothing at all to do with what's going on under the organism. It's just a natural phenomena, a natural physical phenomena that's called lift. And lift is a force that moves you up. So as the streamlines compress over the organism, increasing the velocity and decreasing the pressure, that lower pressure causes lift in an organism. If you ever look at flatfish subtidally, they can never usually stay in the habitat too long, because the longer they stay there and they kind of burrow themselves in a little tiny bit underneath the substrate, that flow is going to get lower and lower and lower and lower until the point that they might be suffering from not being in the boundary layer and getting oxygen and food and everything else. So they can maneuver around and move a little bit. But if they stay there in that habitat, as flow speed increases over them, mostly just tidal flow coming in with the high tides and the low tides, that's going to create a lift on their body, which is going to cause them to be lifted up into the water column, and then they're going to swim again a little bit and burrow back down into the sand, where the flow might be a little bit less. And this continues throughout the day, probably for their entire lives. They have to deal with this constant lift that's taking place. So lift is a force that pushes an object up off the substrate due to the lower pressure above the object. Lift is different than drag, which is a pressure from the front to the rear of an object, pushing it downstream. Pressure drag is the primary force that many sessile organisms actually feel when they're in water flow. So there's a difference between lift and drag. Now drag, if you look at from the front to the rear, you have higher pressures in the front and the rear and lower pressures above. That makes sense. That's consistent with Bernoulli's principle. With increased water flow, you can have higher pressures in the front, medium pressures in the back with a bunch of eddy currents produced that kind of wrap the water flow around, and then low pressures on the top and the bottom as well. So drag is a force that pushes an object downstream or stops it from cutting through the water easily. Now, different shapes can affect drag, and the amount that an organism is streamlined helps with decreasing drag. So if you look at some of the figures that you have here, Z, a simple rectangle. If you're in an organism that looks like Z, the water flow is going to have a really hard time getting over you. It will, though, of course, because it has to, but you have a huge drag. B has probably got the worst drag present there, because as the water flow goes over B, it interacts with that entire surface. A, not very good for drag either, because it has that large front that's just facing water flow. And if you look at C, that's different colored there on the lower right-hand corner, C is probably the best because it's the most streamlined. Now, look at B and C. Do cars look more like B or C? And it's different when you think about things traveling through a different type of fluid like air. Air is a fluid just like water. It streamlines over everything we know. We drive our car with it. We can take some of those earlier pictures from these early graphs with streamlines going over organisms and put a car in there and look at streamlines going over them. This is how manufacturers determine, efficiency in car designs and decreases in drag. Most cars kind of look like B in an odd way. They kind of look like a wedge, and that's the worst possible shape for a car. C would be the best possible shape for a car, which is like an airplane wing. There's a lot of solar cars that are out there that are tested by engineering departments at universities around the country. And they have annual events called solar car races. And these solar car races essentially just use solar energy. But if you look at the shape of those cars, they're all shaped like airplane wings, kind of like C, because they have decreased drag. Now, a lot of you might know decreased drag from swimming. This is an Olympic swimmer, and you can see in red is where drag is the highest. And as long as they keep their bodies streamlined when they're pushing off the wall or swimming, they want to maintain a very streamlined, morphology, they're going to have less and less drag on their bodies. Now, you can also see this based on cross-sectional area. So this kind of looks at shape again. The cross-sectional area is exactly the same for all of these structures. But if you're flat, you can look at the streamlines over that, and you can see all the eddy currents produced. You can look at a cylinder and see that, there's a direct hit of flow there. There's also streamlines that go over it like you would expect, but then eddy currents present. And then if you look at C, that's a teardrop kind of shape or an airplane wing shape. There's no eddy currents behind that. That would, go through the water column much more directly. Kind of makes sense too if you think about that cross-section of the flat disc. If you dropped or threw a quarter in a wishing well, it would kind of meander down a little bit and go side by side by side by side and then eventually settle. It's rare that it would go straight down. I mean, I guess you could make it go straight down, but it's pretty rare if you just threw it in. The cylinder, again, would probably go straight down more than the flat disc, but think about how fast that teardrop-shaped organism would get down. Or if you just dropped a bullet into water, it would go straight down, no questions asked. Now there's an equation for drag. This is the second equation that you need to know. And you should know that it's equal to 1/2 the density of seawater times the velocity squared of that seawater times the area of the object facing water flow and the coefficient of drag, which is a dimensionless index of streamlining. Now again, you can determine drag, and you will be expected to determine drag on your next exam. So we know the coefficients of different shapes and different organisms. A sphere has a coefficient of drag of 0.47. That's similar to a barnacle that's on the coast. A cylinder is 0.73. That's typical of corals, which is 0.8. And then a brick has 1.3, which you know is pretty large drag coefficient. If you think about fish examples, a tuna has a drag coefficient of less than 0.05. Very streamlined. And not only that, because they move so quickly, they have a mucus layer that's on most of their body that sheds the water off them. So any kind of skin friction drag that might be taking place is negated. Excellent mechanism for increased speed and decreased drag coefficients. So if we put humans in flow, all right, so we're pretending we're working at the beach or rocking into tidal, and you have your back to the ocean, which you should never do, and you're sampling along some kind of transect line. There's the drag coefficient. There's the density of seawater. There's the speed of seawater, 10 meters per second. There's the area projected to flow. So we're going to say you're about a half a meter squared in area. And your drag coefficient is 1. If you do all the math for that, you get 25 kilograms times meters per second squared, which equals a Newton. Now, if you remember what Isaac Newton is important for, right? Many different laws of physics, as well as gravity, and the apple fell out of the tree and hit him in the head, and hence gravity, but it wasn't really an apple, it was a fig. So if you look at that 2,500 newtons, that's 2 tons of force on you. And if you think about how many apples would be 2 tons of force, that's a lot of apples. So 1 newton is typically equal to 1 apple. So this is an apple that's being dropped probably from a foot above your head onto your head. So if you can imagine being hit with 2,500 apples all at once, that's a lot. That's not an easy thing to get through. So drag is a force that affects you, and it's measured typically in newtons, using that following equation of the one that's present there. Now, drag affects many different aspects associated with organisms, especially the ecology of organisms. It affects the competition between organisms and the way algae can affect coral via different mechanisms. One paper by Coyer in '93 demonstrated that polyp activity decreased in ballinophilia because the algae was pushed over by the water flow onto the corals, and the corals had no ability to feed. I demonstrated in 2002 that when that happens off the coast of Rhode Island, when algae hits corals, the corals die within 68 days because there's not a lot of polyp activity associated with the corals. Now, there's a lot of physiological consequences associated with water flow, and you can see that the effects of successful capture of prey increases and then decreases with water flow. So in some species, Siemens and Johnson found that for Madrasis to cactus and Balanus, you have increased capture with increasing water flow. That makes sense. And then for Meandrina meandrites, you have high flows that do not increase capture success and actually deformed the polyps of corals. So you have a positive effect of being in water flow because more prey is coming to you. But usually what you're extending there to capture prey are these kind of fleshy, tentacles that in higher flow get deformed, and hence they don't capture prey. Now, overall, the growth of organisms increases. I demonstrated that with the local coral. They grew 3 times better in higher flow habitats than low habitats because of more prey items. Siemens and Helmuth found this in '93 as well for different Agaricea species. And, these papers have been referenced by many, many other papers that basically have found the same thing. When you have higher flow, you tend to have more prey, which is good. But you can get to the point where the highest flow is detrimental to many organisms. Those physiological consequences continue. Reproductive success. Asexually, if you're in a high flow habitat, you're more likely to fragment. And by fragmenting, you can fuse and start growing again. So that's not a bad thing. Sexually, you have an increased likelihood of mixing sperm and egg far away, where then the organism can get a foothold in an entirely different habitat. And hence you have a greater geographic dispersal. That water flow aids in the movement of larvae. But too much water flow is bad. And if you look at hurricanes' effects on not just Jamaican reefs, but any reefs anywhere, or any coastal habitat, there's a lot of abrasion by sediment, floating particles. You can have tentacles that just collapse for organisms. They don't have the ability to feed anymore. And it can also transport diseases that then spread to wherever they're going. But overall, most sessile invertebrates, they need water flow. Okay, they're not afraid of water flow. The effects of flow are usually positive on them unless it gets to be too bad. And you can imagine a hurricane flow speeds could be absolutely devastating for most coastal organisms and the ecology between organisms. So, in effect, how would water flow be bad for the ecology of an organism? Well, it could displace them. It could, basically scour them off the rock because it's so high, and it could change, hence their abundance and their distribution. So it changes their ecology. So flow seems to be this kind of double-edged sword. So what you have here is low, medium, and high flows, and you have some of the different factors that they affect. And that diffusional boundary layer, if you remember that small 1 to 10 millimeter area over an organism, is thick in lower flow and then gets thinner as flow increases from medium to high. Capture is poor, like prey capture, at low, best at medium flows, and then kind of okay still at higher flows. Respiration is poor, better, best, and waste removal of waste is poor, better, best from low to high. The morphology, usually in low flow habitats, you find organisms that kind of plate out. They look like plates. In medium flows, there's roundish, spherical, and then in high flows, they're cylindrical-like. And competition for low flow habitats is really good because you have nothing really to affect your ability to outcompete someone. In medium habitats, they tend to be poorer competitive interactions because that water flow keeps them in check. And then in high flow habitats, they can be both good and bad depending on the organisms present. So overall, most sessile organisms live in all different types of environments, and what is low flow today might be high flow tomorrow, and vice versa. So hopefully, most organisms settle in habitats where they're going to be benefiting from medium to higher flow habitats, which are going to give them all the food they need, all the oxygen they need, and allow for the removal of waste. So flow is determined using a few different methods. You can use plaster of Paris. I mentioned this when we talked about Connecticut waves. And these are just some examples of plaster of Paris that's put out, bolted down to the bottom. You go back a few days later, you can get the percent dissolution or the percent change in weight. You can use direct measurements with different explorers, or the Pasco Explorer, which has a wand that you put that underwater to figure out the flow speed. And you can look for representative species. Chondrus is a red alga that usually indicates water flow is present. But you can also use other sights and sounds. Just by virtue, this is Hammonasset during a wavy day. You can sit there and listen to the habitat and hear the sounds of the waves coming in, hear the boulders moving. So there are many different ways to determine water flow, and you don't always need to have instruments in order to do that.